Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's installment of the Wednesday webinar series. Today's topic is commensurate public benefit, selling public housing property at below fair market value. My name is Antonella Sanmanon, and I am one of your hosts today, along with Jane Horsing. Before I pass it over to Jane, I have a couple housekeeping items. Our speakers will share their knowledge with us for the first part of the presentation, and we will reserve the remaining time for any questions that you might have. You may ask questions in two ways. In the right-hand navigation panel, you will see a hand-shaped icon. If you would like to verbally share your question, select the hand icon and I will unmute your line so you can ask your question aloud. Or if you would like us to get over your question, you can feel free to type it in the chat box and the lower right-hand navigation panel. I will read your question aloud in the order that is received. If we were unable to address all of the questions, we will send an email reply after the webinar. All webinar participants are muted upon entry. If you would like us to unmute you, please notify our team of that or any other technical difficulties. And you can put that in the chat box. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on Hot Exchange shortly following the webinar. Immediately following the webinar, you will receive an invitation to complete a survey on today's webinar, and we ask you that you please complete this with any feedback that you might have for us. With that, I'll pass it over to Jane.
Thank you, Antonella, and everybody, welcome. I know this is a busy time of year, so glad we're recording this, and it'll be available as people need it. As Antonella mentioned, today we're going to talk about commensurate public benefit and selling of public housing property at below fair market value. Along with here with me today is Kathleen Phoebus, James Isaac, and Katie Speckmeyer, and we will be presenting on commensurate public benefit. This is one of a series of webinar topics that we've been covering around repositioning. All of them have been posted to www.hudexchange.info. So this one will also probably go up in the next day or two. So why are we here? The goal of this webinar is to help explain and discuss common issues in repositioning. This webinar today will provide an overview of what the SAC considers to be commensurate public benefit that would justify selling land of any property, public housing property, at below fair market value. We're going to go through case studies. We'll talk a little bit about the use restrictions that we put on these properties, and tips to help PHAs prepare their Section 18 applications. So, first of all, what are the legal requirements set out in the statute and the regs regarding the sale of public housing property? First of all, under Section 18A5, net proceeds must be used for the provision of low-income housing to benefit PHA residents or leveraged commercial enterprises. That's all Section 18 says about what happens when you sell property. Is what you do with the proceeds. However, under the regulations, 24 CFR 970.19a, a PHA may dispose of public housing property at less than fair market value if there is a commensurate public benefit to the community, the public housing agency, the federal government. Public improvements such as streets and bridges do not qualify. So I want to underscore that's in the regulation. That we can't use it for things like infrastructure. And you'll hear this theme throughout the presentation today. If a municipality or a county or a state can levy taxes to pay for something, we're not using housing dollars for that purpose. In PIH Notice 2021-07, Section 3C, HUD determines commensurate public benefit on a case-by-case basis. Generally, property is used as housing for families with incomes at or below 80% of area income, area median income, or serving low-income families. So the justification, so before we go much further, obviously, you have to have a good justification for disposing of the property under Section 18. We've talked about this in other presentations. It can be for health and safety reasons. The units can be obsolete. They can be scattered sites, 50 and under, or excess non-dwelling. Those are all the justifications that we look at right now. And I want to distinguish this from when we talk about the commensurate public benefit. The commensurate public benefit is a method of disposition. It is not a justification. I just want to clarify that. And what we mean by commensurate is something, it has to be proportionate or adequate. So we're going to look to make sure that it's about the same. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. But we're going to look at the magnitude, and we're going to look at the degree, and we're going to try to make sure it's about the same. So, okay, we're going to go ahead and start with some of our examples. I'm going to turn the floor over to Katie.
Hello, everyone. So the first couple of case studies that we're going to go through deal with property that is being returned as 100% low-income housing. So the first case study is using Section 18 and a below fair market transfer as a vehicle to preserve 100% low-income housing. This housing authority received approval to dispose of 2 buildings containing 142 dwelling units and 0.92 acres of underlying land based on the obsolescence justification. So they, presented their rehabilitation costs, and they were within the TDC threshold to be declared obsolete. This justification also could have been efficient and effective, scattered sites, or 50 units or less. So this is what the justification was, but it doesn't turn on it being obsolete. In this case, it was obsolete. So the housing authority disposed of the property to the acquiring entity via a 99-year ground lease at below fair market value for $1 a year. The property appraised at almost $29 million. And the commensurate public benefit was that the below fair market value transaction enabled the housing authority and their acquiring entity to perform substantial rehabilitation, over $18 million in rehab costs. And then the rehabilitated units continued to serve low-income families with project-based voucher subsidy. So at the end of the day, they got approval to dispose of 142 public housing units at below fair market value. They were able to use low-income housing tax credits to perform substantial rehabilitation. At the end of the day, what they delivered was 142 rehab TDD units that were under a long-term use agreement, the LIHTC use agreement, to serve low-income families for a significant period of time. Next slide. The second example is similar, but involves new construction, where a housing authority is going to do new development and use 100% of the units to house low-income families. Next slide. In this case, rather than preserving, they are developing 100% affordable housing. The disposition application was for just slightly over an acre of vacant land. The justification was that the land was excess to the needs of the development. The units had already been demolished, so now they just had a piece of vacant land that the rest of the development wasn't using. The disposition was a negotiated sale for the appraised value, which was $4,900,000. However, it was a seller note, so that repayments of the seller note were going to be contingent upon the development having excess cash flow. So the repayments were not guaranteed, so we considered this a below fair market value sale. The commensurate public benefit for this below fair market value transaction was the new construction of 108 affordable rental units. 44 of those were fair cost or RAD, and 64 were tax credit only. But the below fair market value transaction enabled them to develop 108 affordable rental units that were going to be affordable, into the future under a DORC and then a RAD use agreement. Next slide.
Good afternoon. Yeah, this is Kathy Sheets of SAC, and our next example, we're going to be discussing one property redeveloped as mixed income or mixed use housing. Here, it's typical but not always the case that this kind of redevelopment occurs as part of a mixed finance public housing proposal, which, as many of you know, is reviewed by HUD's Office of Urban Revitalization, and the property is put under a declaration of restricted covenant. The goal of that program is to do mixed income housing, so oftentimes market rate or other units included, and these units then become part of revitalization plans underwriting in accordance with that review by the Office of Urban Revitalization. If there are no public housing units included in the mixed income use, SAC will consider a small portion of market rate commercial or home ownership units as part of the commensurate public benefit and fixed income use. However, we're gonna look to see if those units, those non-affordable units, support the financial feasibility of the affordable unit. We're also gonna kind of look closely and say, can the property that includes the market rate or home ownership or commercial components be divided, legally subdivided, so the housing authority can sell that portion at fair market value, and only approve the portion where the affordable units will be developed as a commensurate public benefit. If not, we're going to say, can the housing authority negotiate some proceeds out of this and get maybe the pro rata portion of proceeds for the portion that won't be developed as market rate. So in this particular example, this one was not reviewed by the Office of Urban Revitalization, and these low-income units, I know the slide says it included some mixed finance public housing, but portions of it included mixed finance public housing, but portions included RAD and TBV. This was a giant campus redevelopment, over 49 acres. And we were really careful to make sure HUD and other offices of HUD were reviewing global plan to make sure that it was primarily a low-income use in supporting the commensurate public benefit. So the takeaway here is that mixed finance and mixed income is permissible, but we're going to look closely at the number and proportion of market rate units and other units, and that's especially the case if it's not getting another set of eyes reviewed by another HUD office. Next slide. Okay, so choice neighborhood. In this case, the disposition plan is always reviewed by HUD's choice team as part of the competitive choice grant process. Typically, the property is vacant land when the SAC approves the disposition because the CHA demolishes the distressed units under the choice authority grant. SAC typically defers to the choice approval and choice disposition revitalization plan as evidencing the commensurate public benefit, and defers to their judgment as to the appropriate portion of commercial component as part of that choice plan. So in this particular example, let's go to it. It was excess vacant land. That was the Section 18 justification because all units had been demolished under choice, all 249. And the commensurate public benefit, again, as approved by the choice team, was a mixed income use, primarily low income. So as you can see, there were 79 PDD, 48 tax credits, and only 20 markers. And then there was also 24 home ownership units, which I believe many of were affordable home ownership, not all. And then it wasn't really commercial components, but more supportive services for residents as part of the choice plan as well, in the form of a community and early center. So the takeaway here is that if the disposition plan, the choice team, in part of the underwriting competitive grant process, SAC won't really question that as the commensurate public benefit, as long as it makes sense with choices for you. Next slide.
That will be me. Thank you, Jesse. Over the years, public housing authorities have questioned the continued ownership of non-dwelling buildings, either because operating the buildings and community service is better operated by other entities that are better suited to provide that service, or the vacant land needs to be put to use to support families through the construction of a facility, or the property management model no longer needs warehouses and repair shops. After an appropriate justification is provided under 24 CFR 970.17d, if the PHA wishes to convey the building or land at less than fair market, then it must provide a justification for selling that property at less than fair market. Questions that they may want to ask is what services will be provided in the new non-dwelling property, like supportive services, a community garden, job training, child care, commercial. Why is this the best utilization of the property for the community? Another question could be, will the non-dwelling utilization be primarily or fully utilized by low-income families? If commercial, what is the long-term, 30 years or more, justification? Could it be jobs? If the primary use is more akin to a general public use, like schools, library, what extra services, not typically provided, but has demonstrated benefits to assist low-income families, like scholarships, use of space? The key question is, how will this primarily benefit low-income families earning 80% of AMI or less? Why is it necessary to sell the property at less than fair market value to make the project happen? Next slide. Let's review an example of a non-dwelling that served low-income families under the ownership of a PHA, and the proposed use was to continue to serve low-income families. The Housing Authority acquired the community building and one non-dwelling and almost half an acre. Section 8 admin funds, so therefore no Section 9 funds, were used to acquire, build, or maintain the building. But Section 9 funds have been used for the operation, such as paying for utilities. The Housing Authority proposed disposing at less than fair market for the nominal amount of $1 to its affiliate to own and operate. The proposed future use was to continue using it as an admin building for the Housing Authority through the Section 8, Section 9, and local programs. Also, they were going to provide social services like transportation programs, hot lunches for seniors. The key point for this example is the conveyance is justified at less than fair market because it primarily benefits Section 9 and Section 8 residents by continuing to serve as an admin building and provide supportive services. A use restriction will need to be recorded through a ground lease or a deed restriction. Next slide. Okay. Vacant land can be developed for community supportive services. For example, to construct a single-purpose facility like a Boys and Girls Club or a YMCA or something similar, or it can be to build a multi-purpose service center that provides a variety of services for low-income families like job training, child care, after-school, tax prep, or WIC. It can be conveyed, assuming the PHA meets the justification for disposition, for less than fair market if the PHA can show there is a commensurate public benefit. Again, the PHA needs to show that it primarily benefits low-income families, and the assistance is justified in proportion to the assistance. If the facility is not 100% for low-income families, the PHA will need it to justify why its contribution at less than fair market is needed to make the facility available to low-income families. Maybe there will be special services and space for low-income families that require this contribution, and no financial resources can cover the cost of these special services or spaces. The SAC will want to see how low-income families will be assured access to the promised services and spaces. Usually there are agreements in the form of MOAs, MOUs, or the agreements that outline these uses. I want to underline that. Sometimes housing authorities will get into these commitments, and it's not totally fleshed out how that commensurate public benefit will actually be realized, because they might have vague terms. Like sometimes you'll see people put in things like best efforts. Or you'll have a daycare facility that both low-income and non-low-income people will be using, but ends up where only the moderate and market rate families are using it, and the very low-income are not using it. But the housing authority has no way of trying to correct the situation because the measurables are not defined well enough. Next slide. Another case study. The following is an example of a mixed-income sports facility that was developed in a major metropolitan community. The details are, it was built on a 13.54 acres of vacant land as a result of demolition. The land is part of a much larger mixed-income residential development. The land was valued at approximately $4 million and conveyed at $2 million, which is less than fair market value. The development was of a large tennis club facility. The developer proposed the tennis facility as a strategy to get more low-income kids to get into college, especially children of color, by developing their talents through sports as a way to get college scholarships in a sport that is not as competitive for scholarships such as football or basketball. While the main focus is getting kids into college, the regular market rate members pay regular market rate fees to use the facility, which helps operate the facility. The benefits are 60 annual scholarships for PHA youth, tennis lessons and academic tutoring, employment of public housing residents, about 2 to 3 residents. The youth restriction recorded in first priority enforcing the scholarships. The key point is the developer had to show how the value of the benefits compensated for the value of the property not being received. So this was a rather complicated situation for us because we had to get the developer of this facility to be able to demonstrate how the services that they are going to provide these low-income families would amount to $2 million being written off. So they were able to show how the cost of the specific services they would be providing these kids through scholarships to use their facility, to get tennis lessons, to also be doing tutoring after school. They were able to demonstrate and quantify the value of that service that they were going to provide. And they also they made certain commitments about hiring local public housing residents, the adults. Next slide. Next slide.
Okay.
Oops, sorry.
Just one more thing, James.
Yes.
But we do know that since we approved this, we know that over 145 kids have gone to college on tennis scholarships, full rides.
Yes, that's a very good point.
At that. Yeah.
School campuses. Schools are considered infrastructure, and the provision of those facilities is the responsibility of local municipalities to finance through taxes, like James said before. The SAC does not normally approve the disposition of property at less than fair market value for schools. We typically require that the property, assuming there's a justification to dispose, to be sold at fair market value. However, the SAC has approved in some rare instances dispositions of property at less than fair market value because the PHA was able to show how the less than fair market value dispo would lead to the development of special facilities that primarily benefit low-income families that otherwise would not easily be financed. Example, a possible commensurate public benefit would be construction of a special facility attached to the school that provides services for low-income children like tutoring and homework assistance, before and after school space for low-income children, adult education for low-income adults, and conducted after school in a special facility. Oh, this case study. Let's look at this example. Public Housing Authority has an obsolete property and wishes to dispose of the property valued at $2.4 million in order for a charter school could be constructed. Originally, the rationale was to dispose of the property at less than fair market value so a charter school could be built, but after discussions, the PHA went back and negotiated more benefits to justify the conveyance at less than fair market value. They were able to negotiate further benefits that include preference for public housing kids to be placed in the charter school, because prior, at the very beginning of the plan, was they would just be able to compete for the general wait list. Now they got a preference for their own kids to be placed in the charter school. They were going to rehab the existing public housing property to be used as a non-dwelling facility. They were going to build computer labs, which would be part of a community center on school campus that residents could use. And they also could use the community center for public housing resident activities. Further, they would have also college-level courses for adult low-income residents, over 300 Section 3 construction jobs, office space for use by low-income families for employment, medical, dental, legal services. Next slide.
Thank you, James. So by this slide, I'll caveat the title here. We really mean non-rentable dwelling as the future use. So here, the Housing Authority's goal is affordable home ownership, and the question is, when will SAC, if ever, find that to be a commensurate public benefit? This gets tricky because SAC generally does not allow a two-part or interim disposition. So, for instance, we don't allow the property to first go to a home ownership developer and who would develop or rehab units and then sell them to a low-income family, because we look for commensurate public benefit in the initial primary only transfer from the Housing Authority. That said, in this instance, and you can go to the next slide here, one way to structure this is through a land trust, because when a community land trust is used and the Housing Authority disposes to a community land trust, the land trust retains fee title and then just sells the improvement or the home ownership unit to the low-income families. So it's a really innovative way to allow for affordable home ownership, but also meet the commensurate public benefit criteria of Section 18 and 970. In this instance, the Housing Authority proposed to sell fee title property to a community land trust at below fair market value. Here, it wasn't a dollar deal. It was 75% of fair market value. So the Housing Authority got significant proceeds in addition to furthering affordable home ownership. So really savvy and well done structuring of this disposition through this negotiation with the land trust. And I would say the PHA did an excellent job of maximizing its use of public housing assets by receiving both proceeds and a commensurate public benefit. The Housing Authority indicated that the discounted sale price here was going to support the work of the Community Land Trust to provide successful home ownership opportunities to low-income families and maintain the mixed-income neighborhoods by developing and preserving this stable inventory of affordable housing. In this instance, the Land Trust was going to rehabilitate with non-federal funds these properties, these scattered site properties that were, not in the best condition as public housing, and sell them as affordable home ownership to families earning 80% or below area median income. The properties and this is the land trust proposal and the housing authorities, are all going to be under a 99-year use restriction that will survive foreclosures of mortgages and other liens. So again, long-term affordability for these affordable home ownership, but not restricting the families themselves under a use restriction. Instead, the land trust is restricted, but the families, based on the land trust documents, have considerable flexibility for when they want to sell and the amount of equity they could take out. So something to keep in mind here. We sometimes get requests to do housing authorities want to sell vacant land that's excess to a developer to develop as affordable home ownership. In those instances, we're generally going to look for the housing authority to receive fair market value, again, unless it's under a land trust. And if we do consider it as a commensurate public benefit, we'll likely want our partners in the Office of Urban Revitalization to review it under their 24/9 home ownership term sheet provisions, given the discounted value. Next.
Okay, just real quickly, Kathy, before we move on here. You can do this two-step process that Kathy talked about, where you sell to what we call a purchase and resale entity under Section 32. Congress was very clear and set out a whole different statute on how we can sell public housing property as home ownership. And there are certain guardrails within Section 32 that help housing authorities and help buyers in particular, making sure they're really ready to make that purchase. Homeownership has its own responsibilities that go with it, and we want to make sure that when a homeowner does purchase a home, they're ready to purchase, and they understand their responsibilities, and the house is in good shape. So that's all done under 32. So,
Yeah,
we
that's
can do
great.
some of them under 18, but we really would, just know that 32 does exist.
Yep.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay, so next slide. In terms of, I want to give some examples of what things that we have turned down, things that we don't approve as commensurate public benefits. Police stations, fire stations, public parks, city hall, those are things the taxpayers pay money for. You can pay them in your real estate tax, or the state pays for them through income tax. There's no reason to use public housing dollars for those kinds of activities. That said, we have allowed police stations or police to live in public housing at times, or to, use a unit within public housing, but we would not give money to, land to build a police station. Because we would expect the municipality to pay fair market value. Mixed income that includes a high rate of market rate. We've had people come in and say, well, we'll put 10% as affordable and the rest is going to be market rate. And we think that you should just give us the land. We're not going to do that. Clearly, HUD put money into a property, and if you want it to be primarily market rate, you can pay us back. Fine. But pay us back. Public schools, again, as James had explained clearly in his presentation, there has to be some mitigating and clearly understandable reasons as to why we would want to do a public school as part of a transaction. There would have to be specific extra supportive services for the community. And in the community, I mean public housing residents. We've had housing authorities come in and say, we're going to go ahead and dispose of this property. We're going to go ahead and put in the voucher units now, and we'll get our financing in maybe 5 years from now. We'll renovate the unit. There's no commensurate public benefit there. You didn't take care of the unit. We want to know who your partners are, who your investors are going to be, what you're really going to do if you're going to do something like that, and how you're going to stage the relocation. We need all of that information up front before we can approve a building to be switched over to project-based vouchers. So we do need a lot more information for those. And then any kind of commercial property, obviously we're going to want to see that the residents are getting jobs or some other economic benefit for those. Kathy, you want to talk about use agreements real quick?
Sure. So now that SAC has been satisfied that you have presented an adequate commensurate public benefit, it's not that we don't trust you, but we are going to look for something to ensure that that use that you've committed to and proposed in your application will actually occur and continue throughout the required term. So there is no standard form of SAC use agreement, unlike a RAD use agreement or the ACC or something like that, or the standard DOT in public housing. Instead, it depends on the use that the SAC approves. So we've talked about many here, and it also depends on state law, and it depends on the discretion of the field office and field council. Many HUD offices have model forms of use restrictions that start out as a starting point and include pretty standard terms. And the field office and field council will also look to the SAC approval, which typically includes a bunch of bullets or required terms for the use restriction. So again, we don't attach as a required form, a particular form for every provision of the use agreement, but we say, these 10 things or 5 things have to be included in the use restriction document that's recorded. And again, they may vary based on what the exact commensurate public benefit is that we approve, especially if it involves jobs or secondary benefit with an underlying situation such as James Regain described. Sometimes the SAC approval will also upfront allow for alternative standard forms, such as a tax credit agreement. If we know there's going to be a tax credit agreement recorded, we can say, yes, we'll accept that as the commensurate public benefit use restriction, and there's no need to work with the field office and field council in coming up with a separate standalone Section 18 use agreement. So the PHA, we do expect the PHA to monitor the use agreement. Field offices can monitor the use, based on their risk analyses, but we also expect the PHA to make sure whoever they transfer this property to is complying with the use agreement and the commensurate public benefit that they indicated to HUD in their application. Next. Katie?
Hello. So we've reviewed several different case studies, and you've seen different ways that this can go. We just wanted to highlight a few best practices as you're thinking through the ways this might work for your housing authority. Several people, a couple of these deals have mentioned situations where you don't have to choose one or the other. A deal for $1 or a land donation and all returning affordable. You can potentially combine these two strategies. For example, if your intention is to develop a mixed income community that maybe has a larger number of market rate units, not all market rate, but not a nominal amount either, somewhere in the middle. Maybe you can negotiate a deal where the property is sold at 60% of fair market value and you receive proceeds in addition to the CPV. Because remember, we said at the beginning that when we talk about commensurate, it's things of equal value. So if you're receiving some proceeds that you can put into affordable housing, then the amount of commensurate public benefit that we'll accept might be less than if it was, a deal, a land donation, or the PHA wasn't receiving any proceeds at all. Another thing is, while you're consulting with your residents on your Section 18 application, consult, and with the local officials as well, consult specifically on a commensurate public benefit, on what benefits are going to be realized by low-income residents as part of the disposition action. Additionally, PHA should obtain a highest and best use appraisal to determine the property's fair market value so that we have a true sense of what the value being foregone is. The PHA needs to ensure that the property is used for the commensurate public benefit throughout the use restriction period. And often this is reflected by the PHA controlling or being part of the ownership entity. The PHA tends to often stay pretty involved throughout the use restriction period. The PHA can structure mixed income development. This sort of goes along with the first point that I made. The PHA can structure a mixed income redevelopment so that it receives fair market value proceeds for the market rate, home ownership, or commercial components. So the components that aren't going to serve primarily low-income families, you can structure a mixed income redevelopment so that you receive fair market value for those components, that they're sort of severed from the affordable portion, and you can receive partial fair market value, and then you have the CPV portion kind of severed from that. And after disposition, the PHA reports to the board annually on compliance with the commensurate public benefit use agreement, just so you can ensure that you're complying with the commitments that you set forth in your application and that we approved as part of the Section 18 approval. Next slide.
Okay, so these are some resources, obviously, that are available to anybody who's interested in more about repositioning or about commensurate public benefit. You can look either on the SAC webpage or the HUD repositioning webpage. We do have a PHA asset repositioning post-closing how-to video as well, which we've highlighted here. So we are now ready to entertain questions. I don't know if people want to put questions in the chat or
everyone is also free to use the hand-shaped icon that they should see right above the chat if they would like to be unmuted so they can pose their question directly to our panelists. Do feel free to do that. I don't see any as of now, but I'm happy to give everyone just a minute or two.
Yeah, we did get the one question about what does the DORC stand for, and that the Declaration of Restrictive Covenants, which is used for mixed finance in place of the deed of trust. And Matthew Johnson asked, will these slides be available? Yes, we will post these slides as well on the HUD repositioning webpage. So you can go back over them if you choose.
I'll also follow up with everyone with the survey, and I'll attach the slide deck right away. The recording will probably take a couple of days. But I appreciate everyone's time today. Jane, are there any other questions that I'm missing?
I'm not seeing any others. Does anyone else have other questions? I don't know that I'm seeing any hands raised.
Me neither. With that,
thank you